Moral relativism has become the backbone of our society. What is the true definition of tolerance?
The myth of moral neutrality.
Morality deals with principles of rights. Hope is believing in God's promises.
Who made God? Very interesting question, valid question. Who made God? The questioner fails to understand that everything that is made must have a beginning. God does not have a beginning, therefore God could not be made. The world must have a beginning, therefore the world must have been created, made, constructed by someone, and this someone does not have a beginning, could not have had a beginning, therefore could not have been made by someone else. So everything that has a beginning must be made, and God, because He does not have a beginning, could not have been made. So going back to the four possible explanations, the world is not an illusion, the world is not self-created, the world is not eternal, the world must be created. That, in short, is the gist of the cosmological arguments. Now we can go to a more philosophical argument called the ontological argument. Ontological argument, also known as the argument from necessity, and it argues that God is a necessary being to exist. The argument states that if there was ever a time when absolutely nothing existed, then there would be nothing now. Pretty good, safe, logical assumption, premise. If there was ever a time when absolutely nothing existed, then there would be nothing now. Second premise of the argument. Since something does exist, something must have existed forever. Since something does exist, something must have existed forever. Everything that exists can be classified as either matter or mind, material or immaterial. Therefore, matter or mind is eternal. But we know that matter is not eternal, per the evidence cited above, per the second law of thermodynamics. Therefore, it is mind that must be eternal. So, let me go back to the argument and rephrase the argument in simpler terms. Or maybe just to reiterate the argument. If there was ever a time when absolutely nothing existed, then there would be nothing now. Second premise. Since something does exist, something must have existed forever. Third premise. Everything that exists could be classified as either matter, material, or mind, immaterial. Therefore, either matter or mind have always existed. But we know that matter could not have always been in existence, because we just discussed the second law of thermodynamics. Therefore, mind must have always existed and eternal, and that mind is God. As a matter of fact, one of the translations, or one of the meanings of the word logos that St. John used in his gospel is mind. Mind. The ontological argument goes on to say that there are two types of objects in the universe: contingent beings and necessary beings. Contingent beings basically mean that these beings depend, or their existence depend on something outside of them, or is contingent upon something else. And necessary beings, in other words, beings whose existence does not depend or is not contingent upon anything else. So if something exists, it is either contingent or necessary. In other words, this laptop, this computer, is a contingent object. In other words, it is dependent upon someone that caused this computer to exist. This computer could not have just made itself into existence. It is not necessary for it to exist. This is the effect of a cause. In other words, its essence is dependent upon the existence of someone that made it come to exist. Likewise, this table, this microphone, all these objects are not necessary objects. These are contingent objects. In other words, their existence is contingent upon someone that fashioned them or constructed these objects. So if something exists, it is either contingent or necessary, because there are only two types of objects in this world. Something contingent implies something necessary. And something exists. Therefore, something necessary exists. This is a little difficult to understand and to grasp, but if you follow the premises, the conclusion follows. If something exists, it is either contingent or necessary. Something contingent implies the existence of something necessary. And something does exist. We know that the world does exist. Then something or someone that is necessary must have caused this contingent universe to exist. So a contingent being cannot exist without a necessary being causing its existence. In other words, this laptop, like I mentioned, could not have just come into existence out of nothing. This laptop is contingent. The person that put this laptop together is also contingent upon someone else that caused this person, that caused this laptop to exist. In other words, if something exists, there must be what it takes for it to exist. And what it takes for the universe to exist, listen to this premise, what it takes the universe to exist cannot exist within itself. In other words, something outside of this computer must have existed to cause this computer to exist. And that refutes the argument that states that the world is self-created. It created itself. In other words, if I see a chair, I cannot say that something from some properties in that chair caused it to exist. It's illogical. Something that exists cannot create itself. Something that must be outside, or something or someone that must be outside of that chair or of this computer that caused this to exist. So, all these premises lead to this conclusion. There must exist something or someone that is necessary in its or in his or her existence. That sort of being is called necessary or self-existent. In Arabic we call it wajib al-wujud. Necessary or self-existent. This absolutely necessary, self-existent being is God. And that's how we came up with this theory that God is a self-existent, necessary being that must exist, that caused all these chain of existence in everything in the world. That is the ontological argument. It's a bit more philosophical than the cosmological argument. John Scotus, in Tractatus 91, said, "You, Lord, are uncaused, ingenerable, and imperishable. You cannot possibly not exist, because you are necessary being from yourself." You are necessary being from yourself. St. Thomas Aquinas said, God is identical with his essence and his being necessarily existing. Another philosopher said, while created world exists contingently and depends on God, God exists necessarily and depends on nothing. He exists of absolute and metaphysical necessity and is the last cause of everything. So the ontological argument goes on to say that this cause, this necessary cause, the first cause, must be uncaused, must be changeless, must be timeless, beyond time, beyond space, must be immaterial, in other words, outside of the material world, because we know that the necessary being that caused the material world to exist must be outside of this material world, in other words, immaterial, and must be personal. So uncaused, changeless, timeless, immaterial, personal. And this is a description of our Creator, Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ.